let's work through an example to apply Locke's theory of property. So, as I've said in other segments, I have this compass. Is it mine? Well, let's stop and ask. How did I get it? Well, I gave some money to some people in a store in Gatlinburg, Tennessee in exchange for the compass. Now, what would make that, how could that make it my property? Well, it would have to be the case that I legitimately acquired the money and they legitimately acquired the compass. Okay. So, how do we determine whether that's true? Well, I got my money from my salary, which was from the state of Tennessee. Okay. I worked for the University of Tennessee at the time. Okay. So, assuming that that's good, we also have to ask, did they acquire it from a voluntary transfer from the factory? Let's assume the answer is yes. Then we have to ask, did the factory have a legitimate property right in the compass? Well, we'd have to ask several things. Did they get all of the components through a voluntary transfer or exchange from someone who owned the person who owned the components? So we'd have to say that for each of these components, they got them from someone who owned them. The person agreed to get them, and the money that the manufacturer used to get the components was legitimately there. So we'd have to ask how they acquired that. Now, then we'd have to ask for each of the people who sold them one of the components, did they have a legitimate property right in it? Well, how did they get the raw materials and the labor? Okay. Did people freely give them their labor as a gift or in exchange for a wage? And did each of the raw materials come as a voluntary transfer or exchange from someone who legitimately owned them? Now we'll assume they bought them, which means again, we have to ask, was the money that they used to obtain them legitimately theirs? And were all the people they brought the raw materials from the rightful owners of those raw materials? Now you'll notice I've been going down one side of things. Right? I haven't been inquiring too closely into how the manufacturer got its money, how the owners of the components got their money, and how the owners of the raw materials got their money, right, to buy the raw materials. Right? And of course, we have to ask questions about labor. Right? Did people give their labor as a free gift or in exchange? So you see, it gets very complicated. The idea is that we'd have to trace every component of it back through a series of voluntary gifts or exchanges from people who had a legitimate property right, and if it's an exchange, giving them something that that person had a legitimate property right to, all the way back to some original acquisition, which is complicated, right? But that is what we'd have to be able to do in theory to say without any reservations, yes, this is Jacob Aufhalter's property. He legitimately has a property right to it. Right? Notice that if someone had stolen it and sold it to me, well, that doesn't become my property. Right? You can't transfer a property right to someone else if you don't have it in the first place. Now that would get some complicated questions, right? They'd owe me my money back if it turned out they'd stolen it and I didn't know, right? Well, it's not mine, but they would owe me some kind of compensation. Right? So if someone stole the compass from someone else, right, and we found that out, well, that person could presumably compel me to restore the compass. Right? And I assume I would have to go to the person I bought it from, and I'd have to go to the store and have someone compel them to give me my money back or something in return. Okay. So you can see that it gets complicated. Right? In order to determine that I'm the rightful owner of an object, I have to ask not only how did I get it, right, but did the person I got it from have a legitimate right to sell it? And was the money that I used to buy it, or the thing that I gave in exchange for it, legitimately mine? So that's entitlement theory. It says to answer the question of whether or not something is yours, you have to figure out how you acquired it, right? And see if it was a legitimate way of acquiring a right to that property.